Hi, everybody. Next presentation that we're going to go through is on, again, foundations of morality, the problems grounding morality. And last time we did the first two problems that we're going to study this semester. On this PowerPoint, we're going to go through three more. The main one and the brunt of this PowerPoint being the problem of moral relativism. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about what we mean by the term relativism. And we'll start with maybe a thought experiment, because I like to do those. So different thought experiment from the last one, which is what's going to happen as we go through different issues. We're going to look at different types of scenarios. So in this one, we got this fictional country of Bialia. In this country, it is traditional custom and obligation to sever the spinal cord of all firstborn males in order to render them unable to walk. This is done out of respect for firstborn males who are thought to be worthy of service by other family members. So after you sever the spine of this child, the rest of their life they're going to be waited on hand and foot by the end of other family members, and this is a sign of respect. It's a bizarre custom. But question is it moral to do this? And like the other thought experiments we've done, go ahead and pause, think about the answer to the question, and think about why you answered the way that you did. Okay, the second question is, if a Bialian woman moved to the United States, is it morally permissible to practice her tradition? This is the way she's always done it in her country. They assume this is the correct thing to do. This is morally right. Can she then practice that tradition in another country where that tradition would generally be considered morally wrong? Third question. If an American woman moves to Bialia, would she be obligated to practice the traditions of that place? Would she be obligated to do that to her firstborn son because that's the custom in the place where she's now living? And the next question is, if a Bialian woman in Bialia refuses this obligation, is she doing the wrong thing? Is she being immoral by not severing the spine of her child? Since the tradition itself says this is what she ought to do, and this is what's right to do, wouldn't not doing it be, by definition, wrong? Okay. Now you can think of, this scenario as kind of extreme. And it is. I mean, I come up with some of these scenarios because they're extreme, but they at least hopefully are going to get you to think a little bit about this idea of cultural traditions. And that's going to be really key to the issue of moral relativism. So let's describe moral relativism. At first, we'll see some of the conclusions that are drawn, and then we'll look at some arguments for moral relativism. Later, when we get to, I believe it's the fifth PowerPoint, we will look at some arguments against moral relativism. And we'll basically deal with each argument that I've given in this PowerPoint presentation and deal with them one at a time in the other. So moral relativism, is that right and wrong are dependent upon the beliefs of your culture. Okay, so we often mean cultural relativism when we use the term moral relativism, though it could be even more specific than cultural, as we'll see in a little bit. And the three basic claims are these. Number one, that morality is changeable, right? It can change with the times. It can change from one culture to another. You really can't go back, only forward, and you're kind of moving always towards a higher or better morality. Perhaps, I guess if you can move higher, you could also move lower. So the idea is at least it's changeable. That's claim number one. Claim number two is that morality is subjective. Right? It's dependent on your beliefs. It's dependent on what you feel, on what you think. And beliefs, of course, can change. I have my beliefs, you have your beliefs. So my morality is mine, your morality is yours. They don't have to necessarily agree. Right? There's nothing good or bad, but that thinking makes it so. The third claim is that morality is individual. Right? It's up to the individual person or to the individual culture. Different strokes for different folks. Everybody's got their own opinion. Okay? So that's the basic view. Three claims of moral relativism. It's changeable, subjective, and individual. Now, an extreme form of moral relativism we would call moral subjectivism. So we're taking to the individual level when we're talking about subjectivism. It's not the culture that determines what's right or wrong, but it's the individual person that can make that judgment for themselves, what's right or wrong. And some actually hold that right and wrong boil down to which the individual has to impose their subjective morality. I probably read that wrong as I was trying to say that. So you can imagine, I say something is right and you say something is wrong. How do you come to settle that disagreement? A lot of times we would assume that if that's all morality is, then the morality that is going to be imposed will be imposed by the person that has the power to impose it. Okay, right is what the mighty. You've probably heard the phrase "might makes right." That's kind of the idea here. Okay. So again, moral subjectivism is an extreme form of moral relativism, but I think moral relativism in general is consistent with subjectivism. Okay, it's just subjectivism by culture. Moral subjectivism does not provide a basis for settling moral issues, right? Like I said, if I say something's right and you say something's wrong, now we've got the same action that is judged both right and wrong at the same time. How do you settle that difference? Like I said, it often comes down to physical force to decide. And now you're not talking ethics anymore. You're talking mere power. There's also the problem with group identification when you're talking about cultural relativism, because there's always the question of what group do you actually belong to. If you think about it, cultures are subdivided, and you talk of a subculture, cultures within cultures. Within the United States, we can talk about an American culture. But, what about this segment of the United States? People that live in the South, people that live in the North. What about the culture of, male to female, or the culture between different religious groups, Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, Buddhists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can even think of, even within a particular religious group, you may have subcultures, So again, the big question is, well, what culture do you belong to? What group membership do you belong to? And speaking of religion, of course, the next thing that I want to throw in here is religious relativism, because some people think that it's what your religious culture defines as right and wrong that actually is right and wrong for you. And the same problems emerge, like I said, group identification. Now, what I want to talk about is the problem of cultural relativism. I have that in quotes because when I talk about this, it's really the idea of whether or not cultural relativism is a true problem for philosophy. And I don't think it is. I don't think this is a problem that has arisen from philosophical discussion so much as from the social sciences, sociology, anthropology, psychology. Even in the ancient world, before those social sciences were developed, you still have observation of different cultures. And the assumption that comes out of observing different cultures is that morality is merely a term that we use for socially approved habits. We approve of this particular habit in this society, and that's what we say is moral. We disapprove of a particular habit in this society. That's what we would call immoral. In different cultures or societies will have different approbation. Morals are generally viewed as simply human inventions, right? As things that we make up as a culture. And I've got a quote here from B.F. Skinner that's worth reading. He's a famous behaviorist, and let me read it. What a given group of people calls good is a fact. It is what members of the group find reinforcing as the result of their genetic endowment and the natural and social contingencies to which they have been exposed. Each culture has its own set of goods, and what is good in one culture may not be good in another. To recognize this is to take the position of cultural relativism. What is good for the Chabrian Islander is good for the Chabrian Islander, and that is that. Anthropologists have often emphasized relativism as a tolerant alternative to missionary zeal in converting all cultures to a single set of ethical, governmental, religious, or economic values. All right? It's a pretty good description of what we're talking about here. Now, cultural relativism is often seen as a challenge to the possibility of moral philosophy. When we think of ethical systems, one of the big questions is, are there moral value judgments, moral principles that should extend to everybody universally? Now, from the idea that cultures have different beliefs, customs, and what's right in that culture is simply right in that culture, that idea there are a couple different conclusions we can come to. The first conclusion I'm going to call the strong conclusion, and it's the denial of moral absolutes altogether. It's a denial of moral absolutes. Because when you see culture X and culture Y disagree as to what's right and wrong, we would assume that there are no absolute moral value judgments that are in common from culture to culture, right? There's no universal that every culture embraces. And that is a claim that we can test empirically by observing all the cultures in the world and kind of just asking the question, do you believe X is right or wrong? Cultural relativism denies that there can be universal or objective moral values on the grounds that moral values are the products of individual cultures. So if your individual culture produces your values, then you can't find a value that transcends that culture. All right, and they're going to differ from one culture to another in such a way that the values central to each culture differ from one another. And that seems empirically verifiable, right? Like I said, you could go and do the anthropological research and look at these cultures and study them. Now, if the position is that there has never been a moral value that's absolutely accepted by every person in the world, then that would seem likely to be true, right? It's hard to think of any one value that everybody agrees on. You could say murder is wrong. Well, sure, majority of people historically have thought murder is probably a bad idea, but it doesn't mean there isn't an individual out there that thought murder is just the greatest thing in the world. Right? We call these people serial killers. But you get the idea. It doesn't seem to be universal among man, even the claim that murder is wrong. Okay. Now, if the position is that there's never been a moral value accepted absolutely by every culture, that would seem possibly to be false. Right? We're not talking every individual, but every group of people. Right? It'd be hard to find a culture that says murder is good. You may be find an individual person that says murder is good, but it's hard to find a culture that'll say that. So I'll give you some examples here of things that seem to be common among cultures universally. No culture seems to tolerate, again, lying, stealing, violence within what we call the in-group. Okay, the incest taboo seems to be virtually universal. There may be different definitions of what constitutes incest, but it's a taboo wherever it falls in its definition. No culture values suffering as an end in itself. We may value suffering for some greater goal or good, but not simply for suffering's sake. All cultures tend to ceremonialize death. All cultures shame cowardice and praise bravery. All cultures reward hospitality, modesty, etc. You could find values and virtues that are in common universally, even if they look a little bit different. The core idea underlying those seems to be the same. Okay, so look at the idea of infanticide. Killing of innocent humans without a good reason is rejected universally. But of course, there's a debate over what's a good reason. We talk about the ancient world where they actually did expose children and do these types of things. There were usually, again, justifications for doing that, not just simply, for no good reason. That would be considered barbaric even for the ancients. So it seems to be false that views differ absolutely between cultures. Now, even if it were true that there are no cultural values, or no values rather, that are universal, the conclusion that moral values, that there are no absolute moral values is still too strong a conclusion to come to, right? So if it's true that the premise that moral values are products of a culture is still unproven, hopefully that makes sense to you, what I just said. Again, if it's true that every culture, maybe is the problem, the confusion might be the way I'm phrasing it. So if it's true that there is no value universally accepted by every culture, we still haven't proved that moral values are merely the products of cultures, right? We still haven't proven that. So again, that conclusion just seems to be far too strong. So we might want to go with a weaker conclusion, right? A weaker conclusion from the idea that cultures differ in their moral values might be to deny that there's any set of values that we can recommend that all people embrace, right? That there's a set that, this culture should have that set of values, this culture should have the same set of values, and this culture should have the same set of values. Maybe we can't go that far. Now, if the claim is derived from a social science that describes what people in different cultures actually do, because that's where we see how people believe, currently we see what people actually do in their practices, then we have run up against possibly the is-ought distinction that we looked at in the last presentation, which would seem to invalidate the culture, because we're still talking about a value conclusion about what ought to be the case within a culture, and we're basing that claim on some facts about the culture, right? Just the is premise. And remember, you can't move from facts to values or from ises to oughts. So even if no values are universally held, that's just a fact about the world. It wouldn't follow that no value ought to be universally adopted, right? Just because it is the case that no values are shared doesn't mean it ought to be. That doesn't mean that it ought not be the case that certain values should be shared. Okay, so example that I'm giving you here. If all people enjoy harming others, it simply does not follow that we ought to harm other people. Okay, and I don't think anthropology and sociology or even psychology have really anything to offer moral psychology in settling this matter. They're simply looking at the facts of the case, what people do, what people believe, what are the traditions, but they still haven't gotten rid of the question whether or not there are such things as objective moral values that are universal in nature, even if not universally applied. Okay, so hopefully you'll see this. People sometimes act as if relativism followed from the fact that different groups of people have different moral beliefs, and this results from a confusion of two claims. And I think everything becomes much more simple if you just very clearly grasp these two claims. First is what is believed to be right differs from group to group, versus what is in reality right, differing from group to group. The first claim, that what is believed to be right differs from group to group, is not cultural relativism. It is a fact about different cultures. And even somebody that denies cultural relativism believes that that's a true statement. It's true that different cultures believe different things about morality. It's the second question that is moral relativism. It's the idea that what actually is right or wrong differs from group to group. That's where the debate is. There's no debate about what we believe being different, but what actually is the case. And the question is, just because we believe it, does that make it the case? Okay. The mere fact of such a disagreement might just mean that one group is right and one group is wrong. It's one thing to assert that other people or other nationalities think differently from us. That's undeniable. It's a huge leap to the claim that others are right when they think differently from us. That is a completely deniable thing. Okay, so be careful that you don't confuse belief about what's right with what actually is right. Now, with that background kind of out of the way, and maybe that wasn't the clearest background that I could have given you, I want to give you some arguments for moral relativism. When you take the test, or the essay rather, for the first test, you're going to be dealing with presenting arguments for and against moral relativism, and you're going to need to know some of these arguments. Some of them are very straightforward, very easy to remember. If you've never taken a logic class and don't exactly know how arguments work, pay attention to the arguments I give you. I want you to think through the arguments I give you to see how they work, or even if they work. I'm not going to say these are all good arguments. I'm simply going to give you a list of arguments presented for the relativist case. And then we'll look at responses to them, like I said, later. Okay, so let's just start going through the arguments and see what we come up with. The first is what we call the psychological argument for moral relativism. Psychological reasons are very powerful, right? You're dealing with emotions. And they tend to be more persuasive than logical reasons a lot of times. People, abandon logic and are moved by emotional appeals very often. This is something in logic that we would call informal fallacy. Anyways, the big motive that we may see for embracing relativism over something like absolutism is this idea of our desires. We have a desire for happiness. Everybody wants to be happy. I can't think of anybody who doesn't want to be happy. Even if they're not happy, that's what they would desire to be. Now, what goes along with our desires are very often fears, right? Your desire for happiness coincides with a fear that something is going to interrupt you from, becoming happy. So fears correspond to the desires. Now, the idea here is moral absolutism is going to be rejected on the basis of fear. That is going to make you happy. If there are more absolutes out there, that's going to interfere with your ability to live a happy life because it brings with it certain ideas of guilt. Right? If there's an absolute moral rule, you break that rule, you should have a sense of guilt about that. Guilt is not something that's pleasurable, therefore it brings on unhappiness. Okay? So here's the argument. Good morality has good consequences. Bad morality has bad consequences. Unhappiness and guilt, we would say those are bad consequences. Whereas happiness and self-esteem seem to be positive things. They're good consequences, things we like or would like to have. Moral absolutism, right, having these rules, produces bad feelings of unhappiness and guilt because we often break those rules. Moral relativism, however, doesn't produce those feelings because those rules are relative. So it produces good feelings of happiness and self-esteem. Therefore, moral absolutism is bad and moral relativism is good. Okay, so there's one argument for moral relativism. Has a better consequence. Okay, that's a psychological argument. Second argument is a cultural influence one. This is the one that's related to what we were talking about before. Because again, when we look at anthropology, sociology, we see that moral relativism is just factual, right? The idea is, at least that's what it seems like here, that it's factual. But again, the facts that we're referring to are the fact that culture A believes one thing, culture B believes something different, culture C believes something different again. So different cultures have different moral values. Here's some examples. Killing of old people is considered morally right among the Eskimos and morally wrong among the ordinary American. Another example would be homosexuality is considered acceptable among the ancient Greeks, but it's definitely unacceptable within the context of Islam. Another example is Jewish men tend to cover their head, not tend to, are required to cover their heads when they enter synagogue and for prayer, whereas Christian men entering a church are expected to remove their hats. Whether this actually goes on today is something altogether different, but again, those are customs and traditions that are different for different groups. So it's clear that the existence of different moral values indicates morality. Actually, that doesn't follow. This is observable, that's observable. This is the next step, is that the existence of different moral values indicates morality is culturally relative. Cultures disagree, therefore morality is relative. That's the cultural influence argument. Okay, here's the argument in a little bit more of a formal way of breaking it down. So across the world, people disagree over moral codes. But across the world, people tend to agree when it comes to things like science. Okay? And again, these are not all my arguments. You could find these arguments other philosophers have presented. And I will give a note that a lot of these arguments have come from philosopher Dr. Peter Kraft. So I'm kind of borrowing some of his ideas and maybe modifying them slightly. So the first argument here says, with those two facts, again, across the world, we disagree over moral values, but across the world, we tend to agree when it comes to science. The first argument is that science is objective. Seems to be true, right? Science is an objective thing. It deals with absolutes. It deals with things we can observe. It deals with factual instances, right? If the world is revolving around, if the Earth revolves around the sun, it's either true or false that the world does that. It's not up to me. It's an objective thing. Now, across the world, people tend to agree with science. Therefore, across the world, people tend to agree with what is objective. Okay? That's argument one. Argument two is moral codes are things people tend to disagree with. Since objective facts are things people do agree with, therefore moral codes are not objective. And that's a valid argument. Again, moral codes we disagree with. Objective facts we agree with. So moral codes are not objective. Okay, so taken together, of course, morality is going to be relative and not objective. Okay, so there's your argument for moral relativism. And like I said, we're going to go back and look at all these. Next argument is from social conditioning. And it's similar to the cultural argument, a little bit more psychological though. Society conditions values in its members, right? You're born in a particular culture, you're going to tend to absorb the cultural values that you're brought up within. All right, so a Christian culture tends to condition Christian values. A Buddhist culture tends to condition Buddhist values. A slave-holding culture tends to encourage the acceptance of slavery. All right, you don't have as many people questioning that. The origins of values seem to be human minds rather than something objective and recognizable, okay, by human minds. So it's kind of produced by us. And what is produced by human subjects is merely subjective. Example being the rules of a game. We can come up with our own rules for games. I could change the rules. As a matter of fact, in my lifetime, maybe not in yours, but basketball has had different rule changes. Right? When I was in high school, they didn't have anything like a 3-point shot. Okay? Everything was 2 points. Anyways, so again, same thing, the traffic rules, right? We drive on the right-hand side in this country. That's the law. You go over to United Kingdom, you're going to be driving on the left. Okay? And again, what's right or wrong really dependent on the culture. So we're conditioned to these things. That's your second argument. Or no, sorry, the third or fourth. I'm losing track of how many arguments we did, but it doesn't really matter. Next argument's really rather brief. And if you're going to pick an argument to deal with in your essays, you might want to pick the ones that are simpler or easier to remember and reproduce for me. Make sure you understand them. It's easier to reproduce them if you know what they're trying to say. It's the freedom argument. Moral relativism is the only way that we could actually guarantee freedom. People can't be free, truly free, if they can't create their own values, create their own moral systems. So if meaning and morality is imposed on us, right, if there are certain things we can point to as moral absolutes, then we're not truly free. Okay? But again, I want to be truly free. Therefore, there are no such thing out there as these moral absolutes. Morality's got to be relative. Now, I'm not telling you these are good arguments. You may see problems with some of these already. We'll look at them in a little bit more detail later. But again, at least grasp what's being stated. And here's probably the most famous argument for moral relativism today. It's the tolerance argument. I would say this is a great one to use. Moral relativism is tolerant where absolutism is intolerant. This is the view, right? Moral relativism doesn't have any hard and fast rules. Absolutism does. Absolutism seems to be intolerant, therefore, right? Certain people that break those rules, they've done something absolutely bad. That seems to be a little harsh, right? Tolerance seems to be a good thing. Therefore, it's right. And intolerance is a bad thing. We tend to look at things that way today, right? Tolerance is good, intolerance is bad. A lot of people, are more and more opposed to intolerance where we see it. One's right, one's wrong. And the conclusion then is that relativism is right and absolutism is wrong because relativism is tolerant. Absolutism is not. Right? Absolutes tend to be unyielding, and the person that defends absolutes is also going to be unyielding as well. That's the tolerance argument. Then you've got two other arguments that I've kind of grouped together, situationalism and motivationalism. We're just going to look at them together, but one after the other, so really not together. Anyways, this is the way I've titled it that brings them together. So situations are diverse and complex. It's unrealistic to hold them to universal moral standards. And we do seem to think that morality is dependent on situations. You've heard of situational ethics. Well, situations do seem to be important in determining what's right and wrong. Situations can determine how we should act. For instance, when it comes to killing. Killing for money seems to be unacceptable. Whereas killing in self-defense might be a justifiable thing, right? Even in the law, you may be able to, be proven innocent of something like that. Stealing. If you steal a toy from a child, that seems to be bad. But if you were to steal a gun from a gunman who is, threatening somebody, then that seems to be good. The situation is different. The same action, stealing something, is good in one situation, bad in another, and it's based on the situation. Same thing about lying, right? Lying to get elected, we don't like that, right? We're always accusing our politicians of being liars, and that seems to grate on us in a bad, negative way. But if it comes to, World War II, you're home, and the Nazis come knocking at the door and ask you where you're hiding the Jews, we seem to think it's justifiable to lie and tell them that you're not hiding them. So again, situations are relative. They change. Morality is relative, and therefore it can't be absolute. That's one of the better arguments. And the next one I think is also on an equal footing. It's the idea of motive being instrumental in determining what's right and wrong, because morality does seem to be a matter of our motives. We tend to blame people that have bad motives and praise people that have good motives. And we even blame the bad motives even when the thing that they do is not successful. For instance, attempted murder, right? You didn't succeed in murdering anybody, but it was your bad motives in the attempt that we judge. You can't be held guilty of dropping a toaster into a bathtub to electrocute. Sorry, you are held guilty. You are held guilty of dropping a toaster into a bathtub to attempt to electrocute somebody, even if the toaster becomes unplugged in the process, right? And you don't do any harm. So no harm was done, but you're still guilty of doing something that we would say is bad because of your motives. We don't blame somebody for acts that are done unintentionally, right? If you don't have bad motives. You're not morally guilty if you drop a gun and a bullet goes through the wall and accidentally kills somebody in the next room. Maybe negligence or something like that, but it's not an intentional thing, and you won't be tried for murder, involuntary manslaughter perhaps, and there's some problems. But anyways, you get the idea. You're not held guilty, again, if you bump into a radio and it falls into the bathtub and does electrocute somebody, because you didn't do it on purpose. So again, our motives are very important in determining right and wrong. And again, motives are subjective. It's my motive. It's your motive. So therefore, morality also must be subjective. Okay, so those are the arguments for moral relativism. Two more problems, and we'll wrap this up, and they're going to be shorter. Most of this, like I said, was going to be on moral relativism. I'm going to move on now to the next problem, which is logical positivism. And this might not really be a big problem today as it was in the middle of the 20th century when the logical positivist movement was really popular. This was, a 20th century school originating in Vienna and no longer widely accepted. But what they did in their way of viewing meaningfulness is really undercut ethics in general. Okay. So let's see how this happens. Logical positivism can be grouped in with a philosophy of science perspective, and it's the idea that true philosophy should be based on empirical sciences. There should be some kind of empirical approach in philosophy. And the idea is for all propositions, only those propositions that can be restated in scientific language are ultimately going to be meaningful. And this kind of view supports this idea of ethics as being non-cognitive. Non-cognitive, if you remember from our introductory lecture, is the idea that moral claims don't have any actual meaning or content to them. Let me show you how this is done. The basic principle in logical positivism is the principle known as the verification principle, or the principle of empirical verifiability. And again, we mentioned Hume earlier. It goes back to Hume, where he says there are only two kinds of meaningful statements: those that are relations of ideas, we could say those things that are true by definition, and those that are matters of fact, or things that we could factually verify. Okay, now let me break those two down into using some different terms. We could talk about analytic and synthetic propositions. So the two kinds of meaningful propositions are these: those that are analytically true, are the true by definition. They don't necessarily have to say anything about reality. They're maybe mere tautologies, but they tell us how concepts relate to one another. So I'll give you some examples. An analytic proposition would be something like all circles are round. That's true by definition. Right? I don't ever have to see a circle to understand that. If I understand the concept of circle, understand the concept of roundness, then I know that that's true. Sisters are female. Triangles have three sides. You can give a number of these types of things. Red is a color. Okay, those are all analytic propositions. The negation of an analytic proposition is going to result in some kind of self-contradiction. So, for example, if I said triangles do not have three sides, that is a contradictory statement. It's basically like saying triangles are not triangles. Okay, so those Hume and the logical positivists would say are meaningful statements. Analytic statements are meaningful statements. The other type of statement that we would classify as meaningful statements would be those that can be empirically verified. We'd call these maybe synthetic propositions. We're putting some things together that don't necessarily go together in a definitional way. They can be verified or refuted, but you can't do it without actually observing facts. I can't just have the negation of a claim and I can know that the self-contradictory doesn't work that way. And they are going to say something more about reality. So again, the negation of a synthetic proposition doesn't result in contradiction. It results in just a different synthetic proposition. And of course, if they're opposite propositions, one has got to be true and one's got to be false. But I can't know which it is unless I look at the world and see. So I could use the statement that winter is coming. Now, for me to deny that winter is coming would be to say winter is not coming. But winter is not coming is not necessarily false because it's contradictory. It may contradict the statement that winter is coming. So I know that those two statements taken together, they can't both be true, but I don't know which one is true. And it really depends on what time of year it is, right? If it's late fall and I say winter is coming, that's true. But if it's beginning of spring and I say winter is coming, that's going to be false. Again, I know it's a cycle. You get the point. Okay. Now, this principle that the only meaningful statements are those that are either true by definition or are empirically verifiable are going to undercut certain areas of thought. One of them being ethics. So let's skip theology, metaphysics, and aesthetics and go right to the ethical claim that torturing innocent children is immoral. Now, that is not an analytic statement, right? It's not true by definition that torturing innocent children is immoral. And it is not synthetic. It's not something I can look at and verify with my senses, as we saw before when we talked about the fact-value distinction. Your senses merely pick up what is the case, not what ought to be the case. It picks up facts, not values, and that's a value judgment that's being made, right? I can deny that without a contradiction, and there's no observation that could ever affirm it. That's irrefutable. So what do you do with ethics? Ethical statements don't seem to be verifiable at all. Pardon, the phone's going off at the moment. So anyways, let me just talk and maybe you won't hear the phone ringing in the background because I can't get to it at the moment. So, okay, so you can hopefully see the problem with ethics because ethical claims don't fall under either of those true criteria. Again, here's the implications for moral philosophy. Moral claims, again, are cognitively empty. Moral claims are merely expressive, right? Emotive, which we talked about before. So when I say torturing innocent children is immoral, is simply saying that I don't like torturing innocent children, or the imperative, don't do it, okay? Only the emotive aspect has any truth value. As a conjunction, the emotive imperative is neither true nor false. So that's a pretty devastating result. If theological positivists are correct, if that verification principle is a good principle, then ethical claims are ultimately meaningless. A.J. Ayer, who is a logical positive, says this: sentences which simply express moral judgments do not say anything. They are pure expressions of feeling, and as such do not come under the category of truth or falsehood. They are unverifiable for the same reason as a cry of pain or a word of command is unverifiable, because they do not express genuine propositions. Ethical concepts are pseudo-concepts and consequently indefinable. So there's the result of logical positivism. One last thing to deal with, and it's going to be existentialism, which is a bizarre one to bring up, but existentialism, put the question in here, meaninglessness. You know, the idea that there is meaninglessness of life seems to be associated a lot of times with existentialism, but we could at least talk about the subjectivity of meaning in life. The term itself is coined by Jean-Paul Sartre, middle of the 20th century, and what I want to emphasize here with a lot of existentialism is actually going to be the exact opposite of what we talked about with determinism in the other presentation. So it's this idea not of a deterministic world, but a world of radical freedom. Existentialists radicalize Kant's view. Kant, who we'll study later this semester in his system, which is known as deontological ethics or duty-based ethics, believes that you have various aspects of ourselves that go into decision making. And of course, there is this idea of freedom that was really important for Kant, but also human rationality. So the existentialists really take what Kant recognizes and emphasize the free nature of man, or the autonomy of man, above the rationality of man, where Kant would have had them in the other order. So we're going to say that the existentialism stresses freedom over rationality, and we end up with a concept of really this radical freedom. And the idea here, why is freedom above rationality? If you think about it, reason can't compel you to act one way or another. Reason only has the force that we allow it to have by choice. Reason only becomes an authority for us when we choose to listen to it or give it authority. So we're not rational by nature. We're rational by choice. Right? So I could choose to be rational or not. So again, what I have is this freedom to choose between the two. So freedom comes first. Okay, so that's kind of the idea. A very famous motto of existentialism is that existence precedes essence. When we talk about essence, we'll talk a lot about essence when we get into Aristotelian philosophy a little bit later. But it's the idea of a human nature. There's something that is core and common to mankind. This idea, again, here is that there is no human nature that's going to determine the decisions we make, the choices that we make, and things like that. It's our decisions, our choices, and actions that actually determine our nature, according to the existentialists. That's why you say our existence comes first, then our essence follows, right? We choose to be what we're going to be, right? Essence, you can think of what a thing is. Right? So when you say a human being, what's the essence of human being? I mean, what does it mean to be human? And the existentialists say, well, it means different things to different people. We choose for ourselves what that is going to mean. Now, the moral implication here is we obviously are going to choose our own moral code. We're autonomous. Autonomy simply means we are a law unto ourselves. We're lawmakers. All right, so that morality ultimately is, again, subjective. The code that we make, again, cannot force us to do anything. If we are making our own code, then it's not a binding code. A code can't tell us what to do in any actual situation. So if we're free, again, there's no moral code that can bind us. Right? Our freedom is paramount. So I like to use the analogy of handcuffs. If you think of coming up with our own moral code, it's like me taking a pair of handcuffs, slapping them on my own wrist, and keeping the key in my hand. Right? I've come up with this code that is supposed to bind me in a certain sense. But if I've created that code for myself, and I have the ability, again, to get rid of that code for myself the same way I can use that key to take those handcuffs off, it doesn't really bind me. Okay, my freedom is paramount. Okay, so again, 5 problems that kind of challenge the ability to ground an ethical system are the fact-value distinction, which we studied before, determinism, which we looked at before, moral relativism, which we looked at today, logical positivism, and existentialism. So we'll look at them all again in the next coming sessions, but in those sessions we're going to be looking back. We'll do a quick review, of course, but then we're going to look at ways different people have attempted to answer those problems. And the real question is, are they really problems at all, or are they just maybe pseudo-problems with maybe a way around it? So, again, thank you for joining me for this session. Again, go back, review the PowerPoints, think through the material, make sure you understand what I'm talking about. And if the way I explained it doesn't help a lot, go read some other people. Go watch some other videos by other people that will give you some ideas, may clarify. A lot of times it just takes a different way of phrasing something for something to start to click. Okay? And I wish I could phrase things in a million different ways for you guys. I don't have the time or really the ability. So, again, good luck studying, and I will see you next time when we start to look at absolutism. Thank you.